Good evening, and thank you all for joining me in my dining room, lockdown oblige, for this talk about Paul Vercors and his story, The Silence of the Sea. I feel you have been lured here somewhat under false pretenses. I'm going to talk about history, and yet I am no historian. We're going to discuss the production of a play, which wasn't a play, written by a man who wasn't a writer and whose name was not Paul Vercors. This is not a propitious beginning. I hope, as the talk continues, that we will be able to unpick these contradictory strands and arrive at some sort of clarity and understanding. To begin with, let's have a look at the man behind the work. I have said that he was not a writer, but he was heavily involved in publishing. For about 20 years before the invasion of France, he had been working as an illustrator and cartoonist, publishing cartoon strips in a number of reputed French weeklies and monthlies, and illustrating some very famous authors' works, including the Nobel Prize-winning Anatole France and our very own Rudyard Kipling. He was at the same time completing his degree in electrical engineering. It's hardly the traditional path to becoming a famous author. This being said, the years of contact with the publishing world meant that he had many friends within the writing fraternity and knew all there is to know about the technicalities of printing and distribution. These skills were to stand him in good stead when things began to take a sinister turn in 1940. I realise I haven't told you our hero's name, so let's rectify that oversight. The Silence of the Sea was written by Jean Brûleur, the son of Hungarian immigrants. He was born and raised in Paris, where he went to the highly reputable École Alsacienne. He had fantastic teachers there who adhered to the very modern creed of that school, which was, the child's natural faculties must be developed, and, rather than cluttering his memory, he must learn to learn. Jean certainly took this to heart. He had no desire to follow a career in industry, as his parents intended, which would have been his obvious path. Instead, he devoted all his energies to making a living from his drawing, and to his credit, it was a challenge he brought off with brio. You may know that the French have a long tradition of what they call BD, comic books, which dates back to the 19th century, and this art is still hugely valued in France today. Anglo-Saxon readers have been reluctant to take this genre seriously, though that is changing too, and in 2018 the graphic novel Sabrina was actually longlisted for the Booker Prize. Jean brought out his first comic book in 1926, entitled 21 Practical Recipes for a Violent Death. If you Google it, you can see some images from the work. He printed it and marketed it himself. It was through this endeavour that he first became acquainted with a bookshop owner called Pierre de Lescure, who was to become a lifelong ally and colleague. Lescure helped him distribute his first comic book, and the two men became firm friends. Meanwhile, in the background, the shadow of fascism was beginning to darken the horizons of Europe. A powerful indication of what lay in store came in 1937 with the Luftwaffe bombing of the town of Guernica in the Basque Country in Spain. The world was appalled by this act of barbarism. the wanton air bombing of civilians going about their daily lives seemed a sinister flouting of the rules of engagement. Of course, this particular attack remains etched in all our memories because of Picasso's superb fresco. Interestingly enough for our story, Picasso brought the fresco to l'Exposition universelle des arts et techniques in Paris. Jean had been asked to decorate one of the pavilions in this exhibition, so he actually got to meet the famous Spanish painter, and indeed to share some wall space with him. By this point, it was becoming clear to Jean that war was no longer avoidable. What actually ensued is still today a subject for some debate. It is indeed a question as to why France folded so easily and swiftly after the arrival of German troops 80 years ago in May 1940. I have read of several theories which help to explain this sudden defeat, but if there are any proper historians among you, I'll be very happy to defer to your greater understanding of the matter. The most obvious is to state that the French army was far too weak and ill-prepared to take on the might of the German Wehrmacht. This certainly seems to be borne out by the embarrassing so-called phony war, which had France doing a slight show of protecting her borders before a hasty retreat. Jean was actually involved in this part of the war. He was called up in 1939 and sent to the Italian border in the Alps, where he had a skiing accident and broke his leg. But I digress. A second explanation for Germany's easy victory is the fact that many people in France shared the fascist worldview. They were ferociously anti-Semitic and racist and espoused Hitler as a great proponent of their own opinions. Much of the misery inflicted on French intellectuals at that time came from the French themselves, happily collaborating with the Nazis, denouncing Jews and communists, betraying their neighbours and friends. It's a truly dark period of French history. I have also heard the surprising theory that some of the older advisors and government officials in France could still remember the horrors of the siege of Paris in the Franco-Prussian War, where so many died of hunger and disease, only to lose in the end. This may be a stretch, but the fact remains that the Germans rolled into Paris with hardly any opposition. When Jean was demobbed and went home to his house, about an hour outside Paris, it was to find that a German officer had been billeted there with Jean's wife and daughter. The young German officer was polite and affable, but Jean rebelled in his heart. He thought, no, I'm not playing this little game. You may be all sweetness and light, but the fact is you are an enemy soldier forced upon us. You represent ideals and attitudes which I profoundly abhor. I am not engaging any contact with you. Jean found this stressful because he was naturally a charming, outgoing man who enjoyed company and hated to be rude. But he was sickened by the kowtowing to the Germans that he had seen all around him. They had no choice but to have this man in their home, but they didn't have to behave as if this was okay. Jean's experience here is the basis for the story he was to write. As for his professional life, Jean was determined not to publish anything under German rule. He was chastened to see that many of his writer friends accepted the German yoke. He stopped all his sketching and illustrating. He managed to keep the household above water by gardening, carpentry, cheese making, and raising chickens, rabbits and ducks. The sight of his friends collaborating filled him with despair. Pierre de Lescure had never let him down, though. He was now boldly working for the intelligence service. Lescure was helping British agents to escape, or aviators who had been shot down. Jean helped him with this, setting up an escape route out of occupied France. In order to work on this, every Thursday he took the train to Paris and met up with Pierre de Lescure. Every Thursday when he got home, the German soldier saluted him politely, but Jean wouldn't reply. He felt increasingly isolated in his rebellion. His friend and mentor, Jules Romain, had fled to the US. Then a number of clandestine publications began to appear, and Jean was cheered to see that he was not alone. He was hugely relieved to see that there were people who were willing to fight. While the Germans were beginning to ban books and newspapers and to exercise severe censorship, Jean believed that secret publications were the only hope. In March 1941, Pierre de Lescure showed Jean a secret brochure called La Pensée Libre, Free Thought. It was good in that it was subversive, anti-Nazi and all that, but it was a bit too extreme in its views. They needed something more measured. Lescure asked Jean to write something for it. Jean protested, "But I'm not a writer." Then one day he overheard two Germans talking in a restaurant. One was explaining to the other that they were not going to use terror and destruction to bring France to her knees, as they had just done in Poland. The plan was to annihilate French resistance by apparent kindness. Jean was reminded of a line in a play by Racine when the Emperor Nero declares, "I embrace my rival, but it is in order to smother him." Thus was born the character of Werner von Ebrennach, the German officer in our play. Jean hoped through this story to awaken the awareness of the French, inviting them not to be fooled. Behind the most amiable of Germans lurked the horror of Nazism. So Jean began to write his story, but it was a slow business. As he had insisted, he was not really a writer, and it didn't come easy to him. This sluggishness in his creation almost certainly saved his life. In 1941, the Gestapo raided the Pensée Libre, destroyed all the manuscripts and arrested the typesetters. A few months later, the other contributors to that publication, the writer Jacques Decour, the philosopher Georges Politzer, and the physicist Jacques Solomon, were all arrested, tortured, and eventually executed by firing squad. Jean and Pierre de Lescure met up again to discuss where next to go. They concluded that the Pensée Libre had failed because it was too large an affair, involving far too many people. The trouble with that, obviously, is that the more people involved, the higher the risk of a leak. So they decided to found a new publishing firm that they would keep small and as tight as possible. The few people working on it would talk of it to no one, not even their wives. They found a small printer called Claude Haudeville. He ran a tiny print shop right opposite a German military hospital, so there were soldiers going past all the time. He only had one quite modest machine because he mainly did things like wedding invitations and cards announcing a baby's birth, that sort of thing. He could only manage 8 pages a week. So every Thursday, Jean arrived with his 8 pages of manuscript to be printed and left with the latest 8 printed pages. Another friend, Yvonne Paraf, agreed to do the binding. She sewed the pages in her kitchen. Jean then got the necessary funding for the paper and materials from a banker friend, 3,000 francs. No one gave in. They kept it tight, so their tiny company managed to survive the war. They called the publisher Les Editions de Minuit, the Editions of Midnight. And a remarkable fact is that it's still publishing today. No one, including his wife, knew that Jean was the author of The Silence of the Sea. The first batch of editions was just under 400 copies. Lescure had drawn up a distribution list of anti-Nazi writers, financiers, magistrates, professors, scientists, artists and entrepreneurs. The batch was ready on the 20th of February 1942. 3 days later, the linguist Boris Wilde and the anthropologist Anatole Levitsky were shot. German repression was becoming implacable. Lescure was preparing the publication of The Silence of the Sea in London when one of his contacts in the intelligence service, who was supposed to carry the message to London, was arrested. They had to stop everything and lay low. Then Lescure just dropped off the radar for a while. Jean didn't know what to do. But it turned out The Silence of the Sea was already doing the rounds in secret, polycopied by the academic paediatrician Robert Debray, who had received one copy from Lescure. Debray provided the funds for another work to be published, and so Les Editions de Minuit began to bring out a variety of anti-fascist texts. Charles de Gaulle ordered the publication of The Silence of the Sea in London. It was then republished in Switzerland, Algeria, Senegal, Australia and the USA. Vercors' work became a symbol of the resistance. On the BBC, Maurice Schumann referred to Paul Vercors, still unknown and already famous. One day, in his garden, Jean actually came across a version of his story, printed on flimsy Bible paper, which had just been parachuted down by the RAF. Now, I started my talk by declaring that we were going to discuss a play that wasn't a play. As I think you'll have realised by this point, The Silence of the Sea was originally a novella. It was a first-person narrative in which the character of the uncle remembers the period when a German soldier was billeted with him and his niece. It has, however, been adapted as a dramatic piece. It's been made into a couple of unsatisfactory films, but as a theatre piece it has been much more successful. The intimate setting lends itself perfectly to the stage. The adaptation we are using for our production in the Progress Theatre is one I saw on stage many years ago in the Victoria Theatre in Hanley, Stoke-on-Trent. It absolutely blew me away. I went back to see it a second time and I have never forgotten it. So it's a delight for me to be able now to direct Peter Cheeseman's lovely adaptation and to bring it to a new audience. You might be wondering about the rather mysterious title. After all, the story has got nothing to do with the sea. And may I also suggest that the sea is a part of our planet which is virtually never silent. In fact, Jean had been working on the illustration of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He found his title in this very well-known passage, which I shall ask Gareth to read for us. Just to give you the context, we are in an old-fashioned sailing ship out on the ocean, miles from land. The voyage has been going well, but the mariner has just shot and killed an albatross, that had been flying alongside for some days. The sailors, notoriously superstitious, are convinced that the bird was bringing them luck and are furious with the mariner for killing it. Sure enough, almost immediately after the act, they find themselves hopelessly becalmed. And as we know, in a sailing ship in those days, being becalmed means everybody dies of hunger and thirst. I'm going to ask Gareth to read the extract from the poem. Gareth is a member of our cast and is to play the uncle in our production of The Silence of the Sea.
And I had done a hellish thing, and it would work 'em woe. For all averred, I had killed the bird that made the breeze to blow. Ah, wretch, said they, the bird to slay that made the breeze to blow. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. Down dropped the breeze, the sails dropped down. 'Twas sad as sad could be, and we did speak only to break the silence of the sea. Day after day, day after day, we stuck nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Water, water, everywhere, and all the boards did shrink. Water, water, everywhere, nor any drop to drink. Ah, well a day, what evil looks had I from old and young. Instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung.
We can see now why Jean chose this title. In this extract, The Silence of the Sea is absolutely not a symbol of tranquility. It is powerful and deadly. The mariner has made a disastrous decision, and the consequences of his act are deadly. Vercors was persuaded that the decision of the French authorities to submit to German rule would have devastating effects for France for years to come. He was profoundly opposed to this policy, convinced that the resistance were the only people to get it right. The resistance of the uncle and his niece in this story can be seen as a mark of their courage, a courage which Jean Brulaire felt was sadly lacking in his compatriots. When I returned to live in the UK in 2011 and discovered the Progress Theatre, I conceived the idea of reviving the adaptation I'd loved all those years ago. So I contacted the Vic Theatre in Stoke. Peter Cheeseman, who created the original adaptation, has since passed away, but I have been in correspondence with his widow, Romy, who eventually managed to get me a copy of the script, and who has given us permission to produce it here in Reading. This is how Romy described the genesis of this adaptation. I'm going to ask Esther to read Romy Cheeseman's words. Esther plays the part of the unnamed niece in our play, whose stubborn refusal to communicate with the German officer in any way makes her the embodiment of the silence in the title.
English theatre director Peter Cheeseman was a young boy at the outbreak of World War II. Hiding under his bed during the nightly bombing raids over Newcastle upon Tyne, Peter wondered whether he and his sister would be alive the next morning. As a teenager, he experienced the shocking film images of the liberation of the Nazi prison camps. Years later, when interviewing surviving prisoners of war for a documentary play, he began to question how he would have personally reacted under a Nazi occupation. Reading accounts of the wartime resistance movement led him to discover the extraordinary history of Les Editions de Minuit and the eloquence of Le Silence de la Mer. With kind permission from author Jean Brulaire, aka Vercors, and armed with a hefty French dictionary, Peter Cheeseman set about translating and adapting the story for production at the Victoria Theatre, Stoke-on-Trent in 1976. It is a remarkable fact that director Dorothy Gilbert saw that same production as a student, the memory of which inspired her to track down the script and create this anniversary production to be shared with a new generation. Such is the power of storytelling through drama.
Thank you, Esther. And now I'm delighted to say that despite the restraints imposed by our present lockdown condition, we now have the possibility of meeting Romy Cheeseman herself, giving us some insight into her late husband Peter and the role of the Victoria Theatre during the 1970s.
It's a real pleasure to be part of this ongoing journey of the silence of the sea, and particularly to know that it was the Victoria Theatre Stoke-on-Trent that first introduced a certain young student to Vercors' story way back in 1976. By the 70s, the Vic Theatre, as it was known, had established itself as a community theatre, a theatre serving its district. And it was particularly famous for its documentary plays. In fact, it had earned an international reputation for these documentary plays, which were created from research in the local district. So they told the story of local history, local issues, local people. And Peter Cheeseman, my late husband, directed this theatre for over 3 decades, from the early 60s to the late 1990s. And Peter, I know, would be absolutely thrilled to think that his production of The Silence of the Sea made such an impression on the young Dorothy that it stayed with her all these years and led her to the Vic Theatre Archive in search of the script, which Peter had toiled over so many hours and weeks and months all those years ago. I think the story was of special interest to Peter because he was passionately interested in history, but also people's stories, people's experience, people's lived experience. And an important part of Peter's work was created from recordings of local people, telling stories about their lives, their work, and the issues that were important to them. And if you like, Peter's mission was to shine a light on those stories and put them centre stage and share them with the wider community. So for Peter, I think the story of The Silence of the Sea epitomised the struggle of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, their resilience, their humanity, their courage, and their hope. But above all, I think he was interested in its origin. Where had it come from? How had this story come to be? And he was particularly impressed by the courage of those people who worked for the resistance movement under an enemy occupation, under surveillance. He always questioned and wondered how he would have behaved in that situation. It fascinated him. So this too is a story of resilience, hope, and humanity, and something which inspires us all today. So I do hope that this new production comes to fruition, and I wish it well, and I look forward very much to seeing it.
Thank you, Romy. We could never have developed this project without the warm support of the Victoria Theatre. I should add that we have also been given the blessing of François Brulaire, Jean Brulère's son, who runs his estate. He wishes us all good things for this sympathique projet. My thanks to all who helped create this little film, and especially the wonderful Martin, who worked all the technical magic. And to you all who took the trouble to spend this little time with us, thank you.